church family. It is good to be back in the book of Genesis. I know many of you have been missing the Genesis study in adult Sunday school class. Well, here at long last, we're back in the book of Genesis. And man, it is a great chapter. We just finished up the death of Sarah, if you remember, before we stopped meeting for the quarantine. So today we are starting in Genesis chapter 24. It's right around the middle of the book of Genesis, and it's really significant to note. And in fact, it composes the largest chapter in the book of Genesis. And so the content of Genesis chapter 24 is going to be really significant for us. It's almost the central piece of the puzzle in the narrative of Genesis. I'm excited to get into it. And of all things, it is telling us the story of a marriage. And man, it's a fun story. So let me set this up. This is the marriage of Isaac to his wife Rebekah. And that's really significant because it's going to be through marriage that the nation is birthed, right? It's going to be through husband and wife and childbirth and children, and the nation is going to grow in that way. This is very much a genetic thing that's being born here. So in the church, our faith, our family of faith grows through the expression of faith from one person to another, the telling of the good news of life in Jesus. In the Old Testament, as the story of Israel is unfolding, God's plan is going to be unfolded through a nation and through a people. And it starts with this young couple, Isaac and Rebekah. But there's two guidelines that start out that narrative. And as we dig in, I think these guidelines are going to be so important for us today, especially in the middle of the social unrest that we find ourselves in. So let me begin by reading verse 1. Now, Abraham was old, well advanced in years, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. And Abraham said to his servant, the oldest of his household, who had charge of all that he had, put your hand under my thigh, that I may make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I dwell. But will go to my country and to my kindred and take a wife for my son Isaac. So I want to pause there and just unpack that for a moment. First of all, what's this under the thigh language? Well, it is pretty graphic. And the idea is that Abraham says to his servant, the oldest and basically his most senior manager of all of he possesses, and he says, listen, I want you to put your hand under my thigh. In other words, he's going to hold Abraham's testicles. He's going to hold his privates. And he's going to make a vow as he does that. Now, that's really graphic, and it's really uncomfortable. And what's going on with that? And I hear you, right? But understand this. This is the birth of a nation, and it's going to be through children. And so this is all of God's promises. Remember, Abraham's promise that was through Isaac, through the seed of Isaac, all the nations would be blessed. So there's nothing sexual about this, but it is about God fulfilling the promise of children and of a family that would grow to be more numerous than the sand on the seashore, more numerous than the stars in heaven. And so this is the promise that Abraham lives by. And he's telling the servant, I want you to swear by the promise that has guided my life. And so he's bringing to bear all of God's promises as he's issuing these commands to his servant. Abraham said to his servant, the oldest of his household. So Abraham's very blessed. He takes his senior manager, his senior servant, and he says, hey, I want you to swear by the things that the promise that I've lived by, and I want you to swear to not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I live. So this is the first principle, the first of two. We're only going to cover 9 verses today, but the first of 2 principles in these verses that's so significant. Abraham says to his servant, hey, I live among an ungodly people, and these people, I don't want their influence in my son's life, in his marriage. More than that, I don't want their influence to shape the nation that will be born from me, the nation that will be born from Isaac, the child of the promise. And so that's our first principle. Hey, man, in the middle of a world that is full of chaos and every kind of disorder, the unions that are intimate to us, like marriage, man, these things They need to be reserved for the people of God. Abraham says, I live among an ungodly people. And though I might buy land, I might have contracts, I might have treaties, there by no means will be an invitation for them to influence the faith that God has established and will establish through the nation of Israel. Abraham says, hey, you cannot get a wife from the people I live among. Their faith, their idolatry, their paganism, their religion will have nothing to do with the worship of God. And my family, my son, my descendants will worship Yahweh. So that's our first one. Do not, by any means, get a wife from among these people. Do not mix in unholiness with your faith. Do not mix in the world's perspective on stuff into your relationship with God. Maintain that inner walk with Him in purity. By the way, that influence is ever present, and that is always a battle. That's why Abraham makes such a big deal. It's why the servant's going to have to travel so many hundreds of miles. Why this is just going to be an arduous and long story is because this is a big deal. Every billboard you see, every TV show you see, it's all got an agenda. And in all of it, there's this attempt, this reach from the influence of the world to grab our hearts and to shape it and to move it and to introduce idolatry and to pull us away from intimacy with God. You live in that. Abraham lived in that. And he said, man, by no means will this get into my family. He continues. The servant said to him, perhaps the woman may not be willing to follow me to this land. Great question. The servant says, so I got to go, travel this whole long distance to the place where you're from. What if the woman won't be willing to come? What if she's not going to follow me? Abraham said to him, see to it that you, must I then take your son back to the land from which you came? The servant says, maybe I should take Isaac with me to where you came from. Oh, I recognize that longing. I recognize that. Notice what happens. Abraham says, see to it that you do not take my son back there. The Lord, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from the land of my kindred, and who spoke to me and swore to me, to your offspring I will give this land. He will send his angel before you, and you shall take a wife for my son from there. But if the woman is not willing to follow you, then you will be free from this oath of mine. Only you must not take my son back there. So the servant put his hand under the thigh of Abraham, his master, and swore to him concerning this matter. Abraham is so concerned that Isaac would go back home. He knows that there's his people, there's the family, there's where life could be good, and he knows the draw of that. But Abraham says, hey, wait a second, this is the land God has claimed for us. My son must never even get a taste of that. We need to stay where God has planted, where God has promised. And we need to flourish here. And that's an interesting contrast, isn't it, with you cannot marry the people of this land, but you must stay in this land. You've got to feel that tension. I'm reminded of a verse in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. We covered it in our series some time ago in the sermons. Verse 9, I wrote to you in my letters not to associate with sexually immoral people, not at all meaning the sexually immoral of this world, or the greedy and swindlers or idolaters, since then you would need to go out of the world. What's Paul's point? Hey man, you live in an ungodly time. And it's the point for you and me, by the way. We live in a world of chaos. Do you hold up to somebody a resume? Well, if you do these things, I cannot be your friend. And say and go through the crowd and figure out who you associate with. No, he says, man, we live in the middle of an ungodly time. But you stay there. You make those friendships. You influence those people. You share the gospel with them. By the way, what does that list look like to us today? So many times it's not even about morality. So many times it's about politics. So many times it's about age. I don't like hanging out with people outside of my age group. It's about station in life. Oh, that's the young couples. I'm single. I don't want to be with the couples. And we have a whole list of things. This is the stuff I'm comfortable with. And I only want to engage there. Man, how short-sighted. Don't be like that. God said to Abraham, hey, You got to stay here, and my son's going to stay here. A wife from elsewhere. We're not introducing the faith of this people, the immorality, the idolatry of the people among we live. Man, we're not polluting our faith with that. But yet we stay there. We stay there where we're planted, where God's calling us. Okay, that's first 9 verses. We'll continue with the next set next week. See you next time, guys.